Today we're working with the Roland MC-80EX microcomposer, a 16-track sequencer released in 1999. This particular unit has firmware 1.08 installed, but we'll take it up to 1.15, the last known firmware revision Roland released for this model. Using the service notes as a guideline, we're going to enter into test mode. And among other things, test mode will confirm for us the version of the firmware installed. If you hold down record, chain play, and arpeggiator buttons simultaneously while you boot the machine on, it will immediately launch into test mode. And on the very first page of the test mode, we see that in fact we have 1.08 firmware installed, which is exactly how I purchased the unit from a man in Australia on eBay earlier this year. Now that we have this confirmed, we can move to the next stage, which is creating a floppy disk that'll have the correct software for the update. You'll need a high-density 3.5-inch floppy disk that holds 1.44 megabytes of data. The official Roland support site didn't have the firmware, but I was able to locate it at the forums on VintageSynth.com. Searching further, I was able to find a procedure to put the firmware onto a floppy disk. I found that at the forums at ROLANDCLAN.com. I simply extracted the firmware from the zip file I downloaded and I moved it to the desktop. Once I had the firmware file located on the desktop, I went ahead and I followed the instructions I found on ROLANDCLAN. The mitk1.rom file was moved to the root level of the C drive, not tucked away in any additional folders. In this next section, I go over the MS-DOS command prompt instructions on how to put the firmware file onto the floppy disk drive. Now, you saw previously that I put the firmware file at the root level of the C drive in Windows. But now, when I boot into MS-DOS at the command prompt, it shows that the firmware file, the mitk1.rom file, is actually at the root level of the D drive. I don't know why this is. I highly recommend familiarizing yourself with MS-DOS commands to navigate and find out where your file, your firmware file for the MC-80 might reside following the previous instructions I gave you. So in the upcoming segment, you'll see that I am actually on the D drive pathway, although I am giving you the basic C drive pathway instructions to get the procedure done. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'm happy to try to make as much clarification as possible. Once that firmware file is tucked away in your C drive, restart the computer, but this time hold the Shift key all the while and you will boot into safe mode. Select Troubleshoot, then go into Advanced Options, and under Advanced Options, select the command prompt, which is essentially MS-DOS mode. You'll still need to use your credentials to log in, but once you do, go ahead and pop a 3.5-inch high-density floppy disk into a floppy drive. I used a USB drive in this case, and use the format A: command to format the floppy disk that you just put into that floppy drive. Now it'll take a while to format. Old technology took a long time to do anything, but once it's done, you can continue, and it'll ask you if you want to name the volume. I just hit enter to not name the volume, and then I press N when prompted because I no longer want to format any other floppies. Once this is done, I'd go ahead and check out and see what is actually on the C drive. Once you change the drive path, I would check out the directory listing by typing dir. This way you can make sure that the mitk1.rom file is exactly in the drive path that you expect it to be. I'd recommend going back to the recovery pathway, which is X:. Once you're there, go ahead and type in this. Copy C:\mitk1.rom A:. That's basically going to copy the mitk1.rom file over to the A drive from wherever the mitk1.rom file is located. The A drive, of course, is the drive with the newly formatted floppy in it. And it'll, of course, take a minute or so to copy the firmware over to the floppy disk. Once the operation is complete, it'll confirm it for you on screen, and then you can pop out that floppy disk out of the drive. You're done. Well, with at least this portion of it. Now we need to go ahead and prepare the MC-80EX for its update. If there's an internal IDE hard drive installed, it needs to be removed first prior to updating the MC-80. This way the MC-80 will use the internal floppy disk drive to boot from. So you remove this access panel on the outside cover, and underneath you'll see there's a drive caddy held in with 2 screws. You remove those 2 screws, and it's easy enough just to use the pull handle attached to the caddy to give a nice firm tug and remove the drive from the sequencer. From here, it's simply a matter of inserting the floppy disk we created into the MC-80 and powering it up. Every time you power up the MC-80, it looks to see if there's a disk in the floppy drive. If there is, and it has firmware on it, it knows to walk you through the step-by-step to get the firmware updated. It'll tell you simply to press the tab key, and that sets all the wheels in motion, and it takes about 3 minutes for the entire update to complete. First thing it'll do is wipe out the flash ROM that has the current version of firmware on it, and once it does that, it'll install the new firmware on the floppy disk that you inserted. The MC-80 doesn't tell you a whole lot while it's updating, but once it's finished, it'll confirm for you if it's been successful. Go ahead and just power off the machine and pop out that floppy disk, because for all the effort it took to create it, you don't need it anymore. I always power things back on to make sure that they work as I expect, and indeed I get the standard Roland welcome screen for the MC-80EX here. And if you're anything like me, you like to see it in writing. So I'm going to hold record, chain play, and arpeggiator buttons down while powering up the machine. That'll launch me back into test mode, and here I can see that in fact 1.15 firmware has been installed successfully, and I'll be able to sleep a lot easier tonight.